you did write one book after Waterloo, didn't you? Set it in something like 1820?
Yes, that's right, Sharp's
And
Devil, yes.
that's one I haven't read. What is it that you did post Waterloo with it?
Well, it was a book that I don't think ever really worked, to be honest. I try and pretend it doesn't exist. There was a wonderful story. In 1821, there was a man called Cochrane, a complete madman, on whom Hornblow was based, and indeed probably Jack Aubrey too.
Is that Tom Cochrane? I think his name was Tom.
Yeah, Thomas Cochrane,
right.
Earl of something or other, Dundonald. A mad Scotsman who once captured a Spanish frigate with a longboat. I mean, the frigate had 36 guns, the longboat had none. He managed to, he's just a complete madman. And after the wars, he became the leader of the rebel navy in Chile when the Chileans were in revolt against their Spanish masters. And to cut a very long story short, he was double-crossing the Chileans and had made an arrangement with Bonaparte, who was by now on St. Helena and had been on St. Helena for 6 years, that he would rescue Bonaparte and bring him to South America, where they would set up the United States of South America. And the ship was actually sent to St. Helena, and on board was a man called Colonel Roberts, another Englishman who was fighting for the Chilean rebels. And they got to St. Helena 3 weeks after Napoleon died.
Does that give any substance to the rumor that Napoleon, I mean, we know that he had arsenic in his system, and there are all kinds of explanations. Some people say it was because of the wallpaper, because the green of the wallpaper was an arsenic manufacturing thing. Some people claim the doctor had been paid to poison him. Do you think, with all that going on?
I have no idea, actually. I was in St. Helena last year, and a lot of the rooms had linen over them, so I don't think it's the wallpaper. They were covered with linen.
But I just read that his dressing room had that sort of eau de Nil.
There was some. But I think if anybody poisoned him, in fact, it was, and I can't even think of the man's name, who was one of the French officers in his entourage, who was probably a royalist agent. Who knows? I don't think anybody knows. And my own feeling is he died of a broken heart. And
I thought they'd done some testing to prove that actually there was substantial arsenic in the hair, the same way that somebody wrote a really good book a couple of years ago about a lock of Beethoven's hair that reveals that he was in fact a victim of lead poisoning. But they can't determine whether it was because he had this passion for lead-fired, he had a set of plates.
There's so much arsenic around anywhere in those days that it's, just because there's arsenic doesn't mean to say it was murder. As you say, it could have come from the wallpaper. I mean, with women it could come from the cosmetics they use.
Sure.
But there is one candidate who could have murdered him who was a French royalist. I don't think the Brits had any real purpose in murdering him.
I've often thought that it's a shame he didn't die in the battle.
I think it's a great shame he didn't die in his first battle.
Well, there you are. But I mean, in terms of what happened to him, I think exile was far worse for him, and being deposed.
I mean, remember, this is a man who managed to make his own legend.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't really have that. He didn't have a romantic reputation in 1815. He made that reputation after 1815, and he did it by his writings on St. Helena. And of course the French sort of gobbled it up, hook, line and sinker. I mean, this is a man who killed millions, not in a Holocaust like Hitler did, but really through not caring about what happened to them. I mean, he said, was it to Talleyrand, where he said, "What are a million men to me?" Meaning, so what, if a million men die, I can get them, I can get them again. I can raise them again from the depots across France. He was not a man who cared about his men's lives, or indeed about the lives of the people whose countries he conquered. He's an adventurer.
Do you think that accounts for the campaign into Russia, which could never have been a well-conceived idea?
Well, obviously, it was not a well-conceived idea, but he obviously thought he could win it, or he wouldn't have done it.
But the cost was always going to have been astronomical. He didn't care about that.
Oh no, no. As long as he could win, he didn't care. He really didn't care as long as he could win. And of course, if he had won Russia, then he is going to be the master of the whole of Europe, and he can make the continental system work. And remember that it sounds daft, but the invasion of Russia is basically aimed at Britain. Knowing he can't strike at Britain directly, he can only make it work if he can stop Britain's trade. And to stop Britain's trade, he has to control the whole coastline of Europe, which is the reason he goes into Portugal in 1807, and the reason he goes into Russia, basically trying to cut off the Baltic from the Brits. And of course, it never worked because he never understood the sea.
When a lot of well, certainly Sharp's Havoc, you are in the Peninsular Wars. in Portugal, in Spain. Can you tell me a bit about the strategic? I grew up on, Jane Austen doesn't deal a lot with this, in fact, hardly at all, but Georgette Hare used to reference a lot of, particularly the Peninsula Wars in, is it Lord John Moore?
Sir John Moore.
Sir
yes,
John
Sir
Moore,
John.
in her books, and quite a, then, you know, there was, I think you're much more interesting than Patrick O'Brien, but the naval series were, I never really could get myself all that engaged with Aubrey and Maturin. I thought that they lacked the life that Sharp and your characters have. He was wonderful on detail, but boring, I thought. I just never could get myself truly entranced with him.
Well, the Peninsula War, there are two things about it. First, it was perhaps the only place on the continent where the British could strike at Napoleon.
Okay.
And it's a war of opportunism. Napoleon has really bitten off more than he can chew. He simply hasn't got the men to hold all of Spain and Portugal. There's a saying that in Spain, large armies starve and small armies are beaten. And so he's trying to hold down these two countries, and he's surrounded by guerrilla warfare, basically terrorism. And it becomes what he calls the Spanish ulcer. And the British see an opportunity there. The British historically have always had a very small army, a large navy and a small army. So they send their small army into Portugal and Spain, really to piggyback on the Spanish-Portuguese uprising. And gradually, over about 6 years, they get more and more success, and so the army gets larger and larger and larger until eventually it becomes a very large army which invades France itself, and that's the end of the first, just before he goes to Elba, the first, as it were, empire of Napoleon. The second thing about it is this, that after 1783 and the sad events of the American Revolution, the British do feel a sense in which they have failed. Some people put it down to the fact that we were fighting Protestants. We always win our wars against Catholics, they said, but you can't beat Protestants. The Americans were Protestants.
Oh, they were back at Montplaquet, where they were Mount Marlborough and the Catholics.
Yes, but that had been, remember, that had been back in 1715, a long, long time before. It's a century ago. So there's a feeling in which they have not covered themselves with glory in America. Even though they might have won most of the battles, they lost the war. There's a lot of feeling that there is something wrong in the military, and then along comes this war against the French in Portugal, and everything goes right. And so there's an enormous sense of national pride coming back. And because it goes right, partly because there have been reforms between the American Revolution and the beginning of the French wars, and partly because the right guys get to the top, one of whom is Sir John Moore, of course, and the other shining example is the Duke of Wellington, who's an extraordinary man. And then this, of course, comes to Waterloo, which is, as it were, the glorious culmination. Then, of course, you get the kickback, which is that everybody thinks that now the army's brilliant, so nothing can change. And basically, the army that goes to the Crimea in 1850 is the same army that was at Waterloo in terms of tactics and so on.
Well, in the American Revolution, we used guerrilla tactics fairly well, in many respects, and the British didn't adapt to it as well.
Well, they didn't adapt badly. The truth is, what you did was that you could always give up ground for time. So to take an example, I mean, when the capital of the rebellious states was Boston, the Brits would take Boston, and you lot would say, "Oh no, it's not; it's Philadelphia." No, it's true. So they gave up Boston and took Philadelphia, and you said, "Actually, our capital is New York." You know, and I mean, it was the obvious thing to do.
Sure, we just kept dodging around.
Britain was often extremely successful. I mean, if you look at its record against, say, George Washington, the Battle of Long Island, the Battle of Germantown, I mean, it's victory after victory, but so what? All you held was the land you stood on. And in order to, remember when the French came in, the Brits actually took 30,000 troops out of the 13 colonies and sent them to Antigua to protect the sugar, because Antigua by itself was worth more in profits to the British than all 13 colonies.
That's right. It was part of that rum slave, whatever.
Well, it's sugar.
Wasn't it?
It's sugar.
Yeah, sugar.
It's the sugar. And it's a huge miscalculation.